The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and tonight a conversation with New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman about freedom. Over the past 20 years, I've had the pleasure, indeed the privilege, of speaking with some of the best journalists in the country. Some have even won a Pulitzer Prize, which is the highest compliment in the newspaper world. None, except our guest tonight, has ever won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, 2 for his reporting from the Middle East and 1 for his commentary. Tom Friedman joined the Times in 1981, was bureau chief in Beirut and then Jerusalem. He's been the paper's chief diplomatic correspondent and the paper's chief White House correspondent. And in 1995, he became a columnist, the foreign affairs columnist for the paper. He does that twice a week, and somehow still finds time to write 6 best-selling books, to host 6 television documentaries, numerous seminars and conferences, and to be with us here tonight. So, Tom, thank you. Thank you very much.
Marvin. Thank you.
Our subject tonight is freedom, big word, and I'd like to start, Tom, by asking, what is your definition of freedom?
Well, first of all, Marvin, it's great to be with you. It's a treat.
Thank you.
You and your brother Bernie, were always great path breakers for me, and people I admired as a young journalist. So it's a treat to be with you here today.
Thank you.
Tell Bernie I said hi. Let me. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a journalist. So let me give you answer your question in the context of journalism. And if you started this story this evening by asking me, what was the greatest story you ever covered? God, you've been doing this. I just turned 60. I've been at the Times now for 3 years. What was the one that really you'd say was the most amazing? And I would tell you it was Tahrir Square. It was being in Tahrir Square for the original revolution that overthrew President Mubarak. And when I came home and people asked me about it, and I would say that this was the most amazing story I ever covered, they'd say, why? And I said, because it was the most apolitical political event I've ever covered.
Meeting.
And they'd say, yeah, meeting. And that at some level, it was about this very deep human emotion of, I am somebody. And if you ask me, what is freedom? Freedom is the ability, desire, aspiration to live in a context where I can realize my full potential as a human being, a man or a woman. And I believe that what Tahrir Square was about, at its very root, was that very, in some ways, apolitical aspiration, young people living in a world where they could see how everybody else was living, to also want to live in a context where they could realize their full potential. Yes, it had to do with Mubarak, and it had to do with corruption, and it had to do with a context that had been built where they couldn't realize their full potential, where they lived in a rigged game. But I've always thought freedom, it isn't just about the freedom to write anything, to say anything, to travel anywhere. It's all of those things, to be sure. But there's something deeply personal about it. It's to live in a situation where I can be the fullest person I want to be.
And do you feel, Tom, that people all over the world share this same sentiment?
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I've thought about it a lot since the Arab Spring. And one of my teachers, a business philosopher, Dov Seidman, likes to use the formula freedom from and freedom to, based on Isaiah Berlin's positive and negative freedom. And what so much of the Arab Spring was about initially was freedom from. People wanted their freedom from various autocratic regimes. But what often stalled it in the next stage was freedom from is great, but there's also freedom too. What do you want to be free to do? And for that, you have to build a context to enable people to be free to. And it turned out some people wanted to be free to be more Islamist. Some people wanted to be free to be more sectarian. And some people wanted to be free in the democratic sense to be equal citizens with equal rights and responsibilities.
No, but Tom, that's more like choice. If you are free to have a choice.
Right.
And you can go one way or the other. But what I'm asking you is something bigger than that. I'm asking you whether there is a concept that we call freedom that is due us as human beings, or is this something that we simply acquire because we live in a United States where that idea of freedom is built into us from public school on? I'm trying to get from you a sense of the majesty of freedom, not a choice.
Yeah. Well, I do believe that, because I do believe everyone wants to live in a context that enables, empowers, inspires them to realize their full potential. I do believe the aspiration for freedom, to live in a context where I can do all those things, is universal.
And yet, as you were saying before, some people in the Middle East, even today, would have a quarrel about that in the sense that in the United States, we grow up believing it is due us.
Yeah.
The people in Egypt and Yemen do not grow up with that same idea. So it may be that we are imposing upon them something that we assume is natural, but may not be natural to them at all, and therefore is not universal.
Yeah, but you can also fall into the opposite trap, to think that somehow we've got it and it's unique to us, and it isn't an aspiration that other people necessarily want. I'm only speaking from my own experience, and yes, as I told you, once we lifted the lid in that part of the world, turned out people wanted to be free to do a lot of different things. Maybe it was to put on a veil, and maybe it was to live more within their own sect. So it's going to be different for different people. But I've found it in my own travels and experience there. It's remains a very powerful, deep, and broad emotion.
I don't think there's any doubt about that at all. In an American context, we know that the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution lays out a certain set of principles of freedom. Congress cannot do anything to abridge our freedom of religion, speech, press, the right to peaceably to assemble, to petition our government for a redress of grievances. They're laid out there, and they are large concepts. They are the underpinning, really, for the society. They have been described as God-given. I'm wondering if you share that view.
Gosh, I confess I've never thought about, whether they are God-given. But again, when I think of our own society, I'm going to give you a journalistic response to your question.
That's a duck.
Because I'm not. No, it's because I'm not a philosopher. I always, whenever people tell me China's stealing our secrets, my answer always is, look, I don't encourage industrial theft or cyber theft, but tell me when they steal the Bill of Rights. Tell me when they steal the Constitution. Tell me when they steal the words off the Lincoln and Jefferson and Washington memorials. then they'll have stolen something. All the things that are worth stealing in this country are hiding in plain sight. Because as long as we've got those, we can always come up with another secret, another industrial advance, another innovation and breakthrough. And so those are the things that I think are of great value. And I find myself bristling at times when I hear our own lawmakers trashing our institutions. What would people in Russia today give for one day of the SEC? What would people in China today give for one day of the Justice Department Human Rights Division? We kick this country around like it's a football sometimes. It's not a football. It's a Fabergé egg. And it's one that a lot of people around the world, would appreciate in terms of these bureaucrats, Washington, D.C. These institutions are precisely what enable our freedom to do all of these things.
How do you think we got those? And this takes me to origin once again. How do you think it happened that this country has the First Amendment that it does? Does it have anything to do, for example, with the fact that there is written into the first commandment in the Bible the idea that I'm the Lord thy God who brought thee forth out of Egypt, the house of bondage, that there is something there having to do with an almighty force liberating people from bondage? Go from bondage to what? You were talking before about from to.
Sure. Well, the earliest settlers, I think, in many ways, were reenacting their own version of the Exodus story, in leaving what they thought was a tyranny, a monarchical tyranny in Europe, and coming to these shores. It's part of our core DNA.
Is it really possible in this country and in others to separate church and state?
That reminds me, that question, Marvin, of is it possible to be an objective journalist? And I mean this, and I'm not dodging your question, because whenever I'm asked that, I always answer.
You mean you've asked?
I've been asked that. I've gotten that question before.
I'll go to the next one then.
And the answer to me is always that objectivity is not a thing, it's a tension. It's a tension between understanding and disinterest. I can't possibly write an objective story about you unless at some level I really try to understand you, almost see the world through your eyes. And at the same time, I can't write an objective and fair story if I were to only see the world through your eyes. And for me, objectivity is always a tension. And sometimes, when you're a Middle East reporter, you have to think about these kind of things a lot, And sometimes I may be a little too much understanding of you, sometimes maybe too much disinterested. I say, judge me over a period, but it's a tension. And in a country like ours, founded, by people escaping religious freedom, but also inspired by their own religious ethic, there's always going to be a tension between church and state, and you hear it at the State of the Union when the president says, "God bless America," and whatnot. As long as it's a tension, I've got no problem with it.
Okay, since 9/11, there has been a lot of tension, certainly in this country and other parts of the world as well. Do you feel, as both a journalist and a citizen of this country, that since 9/11 you have lost any of your freedoms?
Gosh, I don't feel that, but I do feel that I feel that, and what I wrote about 9/11 at the time was I do believe it was one of the most, maybe the most dangerous challenge to our open society, in this sense, that what this generation of terrorists were doing were taking objects from our daily life, the backpack, the car, the airplane, and turning them into weapons. And when you take objects from daily life literally human beings at the end and turning them into weapons. What you do is you erode the very thing that keeps an open society open, and that is trust. We trusted that everyone came in this room tonight, wasn't wrapped in a suicide vest or carrying a bomb in their shoe or in their purse or in their pen. Trust is the very lifeblood of an open society. And what is so dangerous about this generation of terrorism is that what it tries to do is attack that very thing so that we close ourselves off. We search everybody. I went to a lecture this morning at Johns Hopkins on Tunisia. And it was just a lecture on Tunisia. And I had to show my driver's license. I had to sign into the bill, show my driver's license to a private security guard. There are those kind of things that I find they're still at the level of annoyance.
Because you have written that if there were another 9/11, you were fearful that would be the end of the open society.
What I deeply worry about is another attack on the scale of 9/11. Because I fear then many Americans would say, do whatever you need to do. Do whatever you need to do. And I think our response to 9/11 in many ways has been remarkably restrained. I mean, let's remember, how many years was it after 9/11? We elected an African American whose middle name was Hussein, whose grandfather was a Muslim, who defeated a woman to run against a Mormon. Okay? Who does that? Okay? That was an amazing thing. Now, we've learned since then that we still have a lot of work to do, when you see some of the racial antipathy that's been both subtly and overtly directed at the president. But in many ways, the fact that we did that was the greatest repudiation of bin Laden and bin Ladenism.
And yet the tools that the bin Ladens use remain such a threat that you can imagine an end to our society as we know it, were there another major attack of that magnitude.
Yeah, I don't think it's a joke. Just before I came over here, I was reading the news, and it's an amazing, perverse, bizarre story that a suicide bomber trainee in Iraq blew himself and 22 other trainees up. That he was blew up, 22 other trainees who he was teaching and preparing how to build a suicide vest. This is not a joke. There were things that we've seen in the Middle East in the last 5 or 6 years that kind of thing that you have to take it seriously.
Absolutely. Tom, let's talk a little bit about modern technology, of which I am not an expert.
Well, then you really got the wrong guy here.
Oh no, I think you're pretty good at this stuff. No, but a number of people, of my point of view, might look at all of that modern technology and say, ugh, leave me alone, I want to go back to an old typewriter. Modern technology to you is a good thing, an inspiring thing, an uplifting thing, or is it simply too heavy to lift? What is your sense of it, and what is it doing at this point in our national lives to the issue of privacy, which I would like to get your gut feeling about?
Oh, so I don't know where to dive in exactly because I've got...
Do the privacy.
I was reading, I read Haaretz every day, the Israeli newspaper. And as some people may know, I'm a golfer. And I don't know, a couple months ago I pick up, and I buy golf clubs online occasionally. And I pick up Haaretz, and there's an ad for golf clubs in the middle of the front page. Now, how did that get there?
You put it there.
Yeah, how did that get, from Golfsmith, through some cookies onto my front page of Haaretz, And so I find that a little creepy.
Because they knew you were a golfer.
Yeah, that somehow Golfsmith sold my data to some bulk handler who sold it to Haaretz. And so when I would call up Haaretz, a Golfsmith or an ad for a golf swing, I don't remember if it was Golfsmith or not, comes up on Haaretz's front page. I'm reading the Beirut Daily. I did a column about Tradesy a couple of months ago. It's a sharing economy site for women's apparel. And I just wrote a column about it. Suddenly, the next day, I call it Politico, there's Tradesy. I call up Haaretz, there's a Tradesy ad. And it's just...
No, but what does this all mean in terms of, you've given an illustration of how they have moved into your privacy in the area of golf.
Yeah.
Okay. What is it now?
Not the golf, about my purchases. Any purchase. Could have been anything.
And what is it now about the modern technology that would allow something like Twitter, if my information is right here, to find out where you are at any given time of the day? Are there no limits any longer? Because I have a feeling that a certain generation of the American people have no problem with yielding privacy. In fact, are quite happy about telling everything about themselves. Why is that? And what's the danger, if any, exists at all?
So I mean, like, I don't have a Facebook page, and the Times tweets my column, but for me. So I try to limit my because I'd be overwhelmed a little bit from where I sit. I can't deal with people wanting to friend me or whatever every hour. I mean, I can write my column or I can answer the mail now, but it's one or the other. It can't be both. Look, it's been said by many people. Privacy is over. Get used to it. And I was having breakfast at up in New York with a Middle East diplomat friend of mine from the Arab world, and at a hotel. And a couple days later, he emailed me. He said, "What's this?" And it was a blog post from I would say an anti-Arab site that said, Tom Friedman getting his instructions, from a Middle East diplomat. And that's like somebody was there with a cell phone, took a picture. I didn't know what was going on. Boom, you're on and you just got to go with it. I mean, I don't know how to fight it, so you just got to go with it.
Is there a danger, and this thought just occurred to me, that at a certain point, if you lose X amount of your privacy, whether willingly or not, you are also yielding aspects of your freedom?
Oh, there's no question about it, because it's on your mind all the time. You start to edit yourself. I'm doing that right now, in the sense that, I know if I slip up now, that there's no such thing as local anymore. Okay, when we did this 7 years ago, or if we had done this 20 years ago, if I mix up something, if I make a mistake, make a fool of myself, or say something angry or whatever, maybe somebody would tell somebody, there's no such thing as local anymore. You're in a search engine, Marvin Kalb, bam, and it's just, you gotta live with it. I don't particularly like it, but it has upsides too. You can learn about, you're in contact with more people all the time, but I've just sort of given up on privacy in that sense.
Edward Snowden. You have written that, from your point of view, you would like him to come back to the United States, stand trial, and let's see what happens.
Yeah.
He'd be given a fair trial. Does that mean that you consider that he has committed some kind of crime?
I haven't really delved into that issue. What you just referred to is about as much as I've written. And there's a reason for that, because I find every week I read another set of revelations, and I read another set of arguments, pro and con, that make me one week feel one way about him, and frankly, one week feel another.
Like this idea of traitor or whistleblower?
Yeah, exactly. And I have gone back and forth myself on that, because clearly, he has exposed, what he has exposed to me in the mega sense is the fact that the technology has gone way ahead of, I think, some of both the legal protections and even society's understanding of what it can do on one side. I think what he's also exposed, though, there has been no specific case of abuse, unless you count listening to Angela Merkel's cell phone, in terms of someone at the NSA saying, I want to know, what my ex-girlfriend's doing, et cetera. We've had now several investigations that have also shown us that. I think it's a very vital case that was inevitably going to happen, and I think it's healthy that it's happened, that we're having this discussion. I also believe we do need protection from these rising threats, and I find myself really torn. And what I said in that one column is that I also trust the fairness of the American people, and that I do believe if Snowden came back and got a trial where he could properly make his case, it wasn't done in secret, and could actually present his evidence. I just trust the judgment of the American people. I don't know how it would come out, but I think that trial could be just a huge teaching moment, and one that would trigger, I think, a healthy debate and reform.
Tom, I want to ask you a question about the relationship of journalism, as you have practiced it, I and many others. If a journalist comes upon a big story, he didn't know it was there. He discovers it.
Right.
And writes a big story about it. That's terrific. That's what it's all about. But supposing you come upon a story in the sense that you know someone who has a lot of secrets, like Snowden with the NSA, and you participate with that source in the way in which that information is going to be given to the public, which a number of reporters in the Snowden case actually did. Are those reporters, not the others, are those complicit in what may be a crime?
I'm going to give you a very unsatisfactory answer, and that I'm not going to play the hypothetical game.
But that's not hypothetical.
No,
reporters actually did do that.
I realize that, and my answer is, I will answer for my own reporting and my own judgments, but I'm not going to sit in judgment on others, especially in this case where my own newspaper was involved.
But Tom, now, you've been at this now a long time, 33 years with the Times.
I started UPI.
And UPI before that.
In 79.
If you had it to do it all over again, would you still do it as a journalist?
Oh God, this is the most fun you can have legally that I know of. I mean, growing up, I only wanted to be David Halberstam. I mean, he was my idol, and I got to meet him and get to know him a little bit. And I have had this has been the most amazing run. I have never had a bad day, and I have never gotten up in the morning and said, I just don't want to do this anymore. Mm-hmm. It's been an amazing privilege to do this for the New York Times, and the people I've met along the way, the experiences I've had, some tragic, some obviously very uplifting. I wouldn't have traded a moment for it, and I just wish I could be 30 again.
That's marvelous. That's wonderful. And I hear that you were, or still are perhaps, a very good golfer.
I do play golf, yes. Mm-hmm. and I'm on the staff of Golf Digest, so there's
you said that. Did you ever consider being a golfer as your number one goal?
Well, when I was young, I did want to be a professional golfer. I caddied for Chichi Rodriguez in the 1970 U.S. Open at Hazeltine in Minnesota, which was one of my, growing up, great experiences in life. And I always tell people the story that back then, it was a time, it was an amazing time when you think about it, Marvin, before sports was so professionalized, that in the U.S. Open back then, you couldn't bring a professional caddy like you can today, because it was an open, you had amateurs and pros. And so what they did was they took caddies, I was a caddy at my club, and they took caddies from 4 or 5 from each club, and they brought them to Hazeltine, and they had a big bowl in the center of the room, and all the names of the 179 players in the tournament, however many there were, and you stuck your hand in that bowl, and you could have picked Jack Nicklaus, you could have picked Arnold Palmer, and I picked Chichi Rodriguez, this great Puerto Rican golfer. He was in second place after the first day. He made the cut. We went all 4 days. And about 20 years later, some family friends of ours were down in Dorado Beach, Puerto Rico, which was his home course. And they ran into him in the pro shop, and they said, Chichi, do you remember who caddied for you at the US Open at Hazeltine? And without missing a beat, he said, Tommy. And as family friends will do, they said, do you know he's more famous than you are today? And Chichi, without missing a beat, said, not in Puerto Rico.
You've done every other bit of journalism. Have you ever considered at this point in your career shifting over and being a sports columnist?
I have. I am literally on the staff of Golf Digest, and I've written, because they were owned by the New York Times, and for a while they're owned by Condé Nast now, and so I write for them, pretty regularly. And I have thought about it. I've always wanted to write a golf book, and after I wrote From Beirut to Jerusalem, my publisher Jonathan Galassi at Farrar Straus came to me and said, "What do you want to write for your next book?" And I said, Jonathan, I really want to write a book on golf. And he said, "The Persian Gulf?" and I said, no, I want to write a golf book. So.
Well, now you've been a columnist for almost 20 years.
Yeah.
What are the changes that you have felt and experienced over the last 20 years being a columnist? Is it the same now as it was 20 years ago?
Nothing has changed in the craft, Marvin, of how you write a column. I mean, that's still, you got to get an idea, you got to report it out. I believe I write a very reported column. I think the best columnists are reporters. At heart, or bring reporting to their column. So nothing's changed about that. What's changed is a couple things. One is your reach, because through the web, we have maybe 20 million, unique visitors. That's just huge compared to the million, and 1.6 million on Sunday for the New York Times. So your reach, even through syndication, is farther. You have comments now into your column. So there's your opinion, and then there's 300-400, more or less, every day of readers. Everyone's in a two-way conversation now, columnists, And
do you have to answer the tweets or the messages that come into you?
Maybe some people do. I don't, because it's just too exhausting. And I've mixed feelings about the comments because they're anonymous. So people can be disparaging, but I also find that if you dive into them, and sometimes I have time to, and sometimes I don't, you always find one or two just amazing gems. Also, where people.
Sort of the kernel for a news story?
Or things I just cut out and say, that is just so smart. So that's a big difference. When you think about it, so I inherited James Reston's office, the office he used, his last office in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, when I became a columnist in '95. And what a great thrill and honor, to inherit his office as great editor and columnist for the Times. But I often tell people, when Mr. Reston was doing his column, I'm sure he came in and said, I wonder what my 7 competitors are going to write today. And he knew them all personally. I knew them: Walter Lippmann, Mary McGrory, Stuart Alsop, Joseph Kraft, Tony Lewis. I do the same thing. I come into the same, I've Bill Sapphire's office now, but I come into that same office every morning and I say, I wonder what my 70 million competitors are going to write today. I really feel I've got 70 million competitors.
But that doesn't change how you approach your responsibility or what it is that you're actually writing.
No, but it does. I did a book with Michael Mandelbaum that used to be us, and we have a chapter in the book called "Average is Over," and it's about this period in time we are with technology now, so much software, robots that can be above average. But I always tell people, average is over for everybody, including me. And the example I always give is, I've got 70 million competitors now, and hopefully I was never writing average columns, but I'm just saying, I go to China. I've been going to China once a year for the last 22 years. And, when I probably first started going to China, I had one goal in mind, and that was to write something that my mother-in-law in Chicago wouldn't know about China. It's something that she, And it happens, my mother-in-law in Chicago back then had never been to China. So the truth is, I could go to China, I could hopefully I never did, but hey, I'm in China, they have panda bears here, the people use chopsticks, these wooden things, I mean, I could really write an average column. Today, the New York Times, we have NewYorkTimes.com in Chinese. You can click on it right in the front site. So when I go to China now, I have a different goal. And that's to tell people in Chengdu something they don't know about China. Okay, because
you are picked up and distributed in China.
Well, right now we're shut down because we reported that Wen Jiabao's mother was worth $2.7 billion. And so right now you can't get it in China unless you can get through the Great Firewall. But actually, if you go to NewYorkTimes.com, you'll notice there's 3 points at the top. One says international, that's the old International Herald Tribune. One says sort of the NewYorkTimes.com. And over the next one is in Chinese letters. It's our Chinese edition. Now that is a great thrill for me, to have my column twice a week in Chinese. And I'm so frustrated that we're shut out of there. But there are a lot of Chinese speakers outside of China, and there are Chinese who know how to find their way into the site. But I'm keenly aware that when I'm writing about China now, I'm being read, not just by my mother-in-law in Chicago, but by Chinese. And I think that does raise your game. Again, I hope I...
But it takes me back then to a question that you sort of ducked earlier on the new technology.
Right.
And the effect that that has. The New York Times benefited from the WikiLeaks story.
Right.
The New York Times decided that it would send a team of reporters to another newspaper in England where the information already was. So it was no act of journalistic genius to go over there and pick up that information and then put it into the Times. So what does that mean about the Times benefiting from WikiLeaks? Is that a good thing? Is the Times to be proud of the fact that it made that decision? I'd like to know your judgment.
You should really ask Arthur Sulzberger and Jill Abramson that.
Jill was not there at the time. It was
Bill Keller.
Bill Keller.
Yeah.
And he was seated here, and I did ask him
What
that
did he
question.
say?
He made an effort to answer it.
Okay.
Which is more than you're doing.
That's right. It's
no, but you see where I'm trying to understand. You've given us a...
Because I think the reason I'm dodging this question, and I'm dodging it, is because...
Did you notice that?
Right. Is because it is a hugely complicated question, and I have not dealt with the raw material, the legal bit. I really haven't been deeply involved in it, and I don't want to freelance on it.
Okay, then I'll put it this way. Tomorrow morning, you're sitting in your office, and you get a call from The Guardian in London, and The Guardian says, "Hey, Tom, you are one of the greatest columnists ever, and we want to bring you in on something. We have just received from bin Laden's mother-in-law, who doesn't live in Chicago, she lives somewhere else in the Middle East, and she has his personal plans for taking over the world. This is what he was going to do. We want to bring you in on that. You have to come over here, take a look at it, and then run with it." Would you do that?
I would definitely go over there and take a look at it. Whether I'd run with it, would depend on the veracity of it. Would depend on what the real content was. The journalist in me would definitely do that.
Okay, let's move along. The New York Times. I love to pick it up in the morning. 10 years from now, will I have that privilege?
Don't know. Really don't know. One of the themes of my column in the last 7, 8 years is really what I think we're in a Gutenberg scale moment right now of change. That is, I believe that we are in a moment that is akin to the Gutenberg's invention of the printing press, when the way in which information is generated, turned into knowledge, and transformed into products and services has undergone a massive transformation. I always tell people, someone was alive when Gutenberg invented the printing press. And some monk said to some priest, "Now this is cool, okay? I don't have to use this quill, this quill anymore, or whatever it is. We can just stamp these things out like holy mackerel, okay?" So I believe we're at a similar moment, and that I call it the move from connected to hyper-connected. And it happened just in the last decade or a little bit more. And it was completely disguised by the subprime crisis and post 9/11. So we're living it. We're living all of the innovations that it's throwing off, all of the incredibly rapid change. But no one's really describing it. And you know, my soundbite on this, which you may have heard me say, is that when I sat down to write That Used to Be Us in 2011 with Michael Mandelbaum, the first thing I did was go back and get the first edition of The World is Flat off my bookshelf, just to remind myself what I said. And I started that book in 2004. So I opened it up to the index. I looked under A, B, C, D, E, F, F, A, F, A, C. Facebook wasn't in it. So when I was running around the world, probably the last time we talked, and saying the world is flat, we are all connected. Facebook didn't exist. Twitter was still a sound. The cloud was still in the sky. 4G was a parking place. LinkedIn was a prison. Applications are what you sent to college. Big data was a rap star. And Skype was a typo, okay? So all of that happened after I wrote The World is Flat. So what does that tell you? It tells you something really big just happened in the plumbing of the world. We went from connected to hyper-connected, and it is changing every job, every workplace.
How is it changing journalism? Is that a good thing? What would you say?
So here's, we now have, I'll give you an example. With NewYorkTimes.com, we have the most email list. So we're using big data to track now most emailed, most Facebook, most tweeted, most blogged. And on the one hand, any New York Times journalist who says they don't look at the list is lying to you. You know, how can you not? How did my column do? Am I on the list? Did I go up? Did I go down? But it also is very, that can be dangerous because I write about foreign affairs. There are times when I should write about, foreign affairs issues that may not make the list at all. You can tell, there are certain issues that just don't make the list. You write a political sizzling piece about, Governor Christie or whatever, goes to the top of the list, But if you write about, the problem of water in Chad, you're not going to make the list. Now, as a journalist then, as a columnist, do you start saying, I'm just not going to write about this whole set of issues because they're not going to they're not going to get most tweeted, most viewed, whatever.
So what do?
So I write about them despite that. And some days it doesn't go up the list. But there is a perverse, look, the New York Times is going to have more of a left readership. And the New York Times Online is going to have more of a young and left readership, okay, just by the nature of it. And so if you were to write a pro George W. Bush column, it ain't going to make the list, baby. It ain't going to get near, you know what I mean? But if you write a pro in the way you would a pro Obama one.
Dan Rather, sitting here a couple of years ago, said that in his judgment, what rules in a newsroom these days is fear. Mm-hmm. Fear. Mm-hmm. He was talking about the consequences of 9/11 and the way in which journalism covers these events. You've introduced, because of my question, you've introduced an element now having to do with the new way in which journalism has to be mindful of the new technology. Right. Does the new technology, in your view, pervert or force you into places you wouldn't want to be, dealing with stories that you wouldn't want to deal with, simply in order to get the ratings boost?
I think it's an important question to be asking, Mark. I can't give you a specific example right now, but what I can tell you is that if you sit where I sit, it's just incredibly noisy now. You know what I mean? And I find that more and more I'm shrinking my aperture. I got to filter out a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff you're constantly being, written about, basically. And if you take too much of that in, it's really paralyzing. And I start to write for you, and that's really dangerous. And so I really think that's one of the challenges now. And I think this applies to young journalists, old journalists. I remember my daughter was in college, and she called me one day. There's an issue on campus that had disturbed her, and I said, well, honey, why don't you write a blog about it in the campus, listserv or in the campus newspaper? And she said, no, everyone will blog about me. It really stuck in my mind. You know what I mean? And so you to now be, I think, a columnist at a place like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I mean, you always needed a thick skin, but it's all now so immediate, and all comes at you. And so you really have to keep your balance, I find.
And you're saying this as a columnist, but if you can imagine yourself being a very important politician, for example, responsible for making decisions affecting all of us. The question that...
The feedback loop is so fast. Now, Marvin, and it's just, and so immediate, and people tracking, Twitter and whatnot. And that's why I stay away from that stuff, because I don't want to get knocked off my game.
But that has to affect, if you're a politician, the way in which you think about voters, getting votes, saying certain things to attract certain constituencies. Have you, in your coverage now, so I'm putting you as a journalist, it can be hard for you to duck it.
Please.
Have you met a president, since you've been doing this opinion piece, who was a great man?
I think that all the presidents I've covered have had moments of greatness and a lot of moments of not greatness. But I have a lot of affection, this may come as a surprise, I don't know, for George Bush the elder, the father, who I covered as a reporter. I was the diplomatic correspondent for the Times at the time. And the reason I have such great respect for him has to do with a very specific achievement that I think he forged, that he was central in, that so affected everyone that he's never quite gotten credit for. He brought the end of the Cold War,
to Germany's.
To the unification of Germany, and he brought the Soviet Union for a soft landing, and other than one incident in Moscow.
Wait a minute, did he do that, or Gorbachev did it?
Gorbachev, that whole generation, I think, was amazing. Okay. He, Margaret Thatcher, Gorbachev, but he was there, and had it not gone well, he would have gotten the blame. And I think his role in that, the decisions he made, helped really pave the way for the world that came afterwards.
Are you optimistic, and maybe that's not quite the right word, but are you positive in your feeling that the current generation of political leader in this country can cope with the dimension of challenge now facing political leadership?
It's funny. I was just in Israel, and I was thinking about that, issue there. Can the leadership there handle the lift? But I begin to wonder. Really, I think you're asking a very important question. First of all, I know how noisy it is if you're just writing a column for the New York Times. I can't imagine. I can't imagine how noisy it is, for the President of the United States, and just all this stuff coming in now. Someone tracking Twitter, and someone Facebook, and someone the evening news, and the morning news, and cable TV now. And so I think that's a real problem. And I also think that the complexity of the problems you have to deal with. Think of you and your brother wrote an amazing biography of Henry Kissinger. So let's think about Henry Kissinger, 1973-74. He goes to the Middle East to forge the first real peace agreement, disengagements agreements between Egypt, Israel, and Syria. In Egypt, he negotiates with one Egyptian pharaoh named Anwar Sadat. In Syria, he negotiates with one overwhelmingly powerful Syrian dictator named Hafez al-Assad. And in Israel, he negotiates with an Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, whose majority in the Knesset was so big, no one had ever heard of the Likud party. Let's flash forward now. You're John Kerry, okay? In Syria, who do you negotiate with? There's anybody who answers the phone, it comes off the wall, basically. In Israel, you have a kind of majority coalition. I mean, Netanyahu is certainly in power, but it's a really complicated, set of coalition partners. He never knows if, some rabbi can come in and tell him if there's a kosher kitchen, in the Ministry of Interior by 6 p.m., he's going to end his political life. And then hop over to Egypt, and, well, it was the generals, and then it was Morsi, and now it looks like a general again. And think of what a difficult time this is. And I have enormous sympathy for anyone in these jobs.
You mentioned before your most recent book, which is called That Used to Be Us. And here I want to ask you about whether I'm right in my belief over many years of reading you, that you are a very optimistic and deeply patriotic person when it comes to this country. And yet, in this book, the title, as well as parts of it, are profoundly pessimistic. You seem to be suggesting that we're at a tipping point, and if something goes wrong, we're going to be up the creek without a paddle. What's happened to your optimism?
So, maybe let's start with where it came from,
okay,
and where it might have gone. So I grew up in Minnesota in the 50s and 60s, at a time and a place where politics worked. Well, the year I graduated high school, the then governor of Minnesota, Wendy Anderson, was on the cover of Time magazine holding up a walleye under the headline, "Minnesota, the State That Works." I grew up, my senators were called Mondale, McCarthy, and Humphrey. I lived in a very liberal district. I grew up in this place, St. Louis Park, where myself, the Coen brothers, Michael Sandel, Norm Ornstein, Al Franken, we all grew up in the same suburb, at roughly the same time. Our congressmen were liberal Republicans. The big companies in Minnesota then, 3M, Control Data, Dayton Hudson, thought it was their obligation to build the Tyrone Guthrie Theater. They invented corporate social responsibility. So I grew up, it was not a diverse place at all. We had one African American in my high school, so I don't want to suggest that it was some perfect or snapshot of America. But I grew up in a place where politics seemed to work and solve problems at a certain time, and that was a really formative thing. I'm always looking for Minnesota in some way in my journalism, and but then I've gone off to the Middle East, and obviously that cured me. I saw some horrific things in Beirut and Jerusalem. I covered the Hama massacre, post-Hama massacre in Syria, but I've never lost that sense. I think one of the things that journalists have lost. A bright dividing line today, sometimes, some journalists, is the line between skepticism and cynicism. And, the skeptic says, I don't know, I want to check it out. I'm not taking anyone's word for it, but I want to report it out. Show me. And a cynic says, I already know. I already know who you are. And one of the things that worries me is, I did a column about this, Marvin, once so I came back, I was hired by UPI, spent 2 years in Beirut for them, and the Times hired me in the business section. And there was a reporter in the business section at that time, his name was Nathaniel Nash. And Nathaniel was a wonderful, looked like a choir boy, and he was a born-again Christian, and he loved to hear about the Holy Land. So we'd have lunch, and I would talk to him about Israel. And when I went off to Beirut for the Times, the day I left, he said, I'm going to pray for your safety. And I said, Nathaniel, I'd really appreciate that. Right. And 2 years later, after I got out of Beirut alive, 2.5 years later, he was one of the first people I called. And I said, thank you. I always thought, let me just finish it. I thought you were my good luck charm. And Nathaniel Nash was on Ron Brown's airplane when it slammed into a mountain in Bosnia, and he died in that crash. And in my mind, because he was someone who taught me the difference between skepticism and cynicism. And I always kept that in my mind.
But we've got about a minute left, and I want to know whether deep down you are an optimist about America now.
Deep down, I feel this, that I think the most important national foreign policy issue, global issue in the world is the health and vitality of this country. If we go dark as a country, if we are pessimistic, if we can't be all we can be and emulate these values where we started, freedom, opportunity, pluralism, and mirror them for the world, Marvin, your kids won't just grow up in a different America. They will grow up in a fundamentally different world. And that's why I invest so much of my time writing about America, because I do believe it is the most amazing country in the world, and the world will be a very different place if we cannot be all we need to be.
Tom, I'm really sorry that our time is up, because I'd like to continue with that theme, but we have run out of time. And I want to thank our audience first, and I want to thank our audience around the nation and the world by way of the internet and webs and all of that. And most important, our guest, New York Times columnist Tom Friedman, for sharing his thoughts, his insights about big questions. And I'm very grateful for you to do that. But that's it for now. I'm Marvin Kalb, but as Ed Murrow used to say, good night and good luck.